Israel? Why does it exist? Why does it take up such an outsized proportion of the global news cycle? And why are Jews who consider Israel a foreign country still so often conflated with it? Hello and welcome. I'm Zilla, and this is my Athenaeum. Today we'll be discussing an abridged history of Israel, what it represents, and how it came to be. This is part 4 in my ongoing series, Echoes of Jewish Identity, and if you'd like to catch up on the ones you've missed, you can click the card above, or follow the links in the doobly-doo. The history of the area we know as Israel now is, as I've mentioned, one of conquest and reconquest. The fertile eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, known as the Levant, has been occupied in some form or another for about 2 million years. The people that we can recognize as the ancestors of the Israelites, or the Jewish people, show up sometime in the early Iron Age, but the independent kingdom, the monotheistic monarchy of Israel, is founded sometime around 1000 BC. Though there were many invasions and resettlements, a large Jewish population persisted in the area. That's not to say that they were a majority, or that they ruled themselves or owned the land, but a population did persist. The Assyrians and the Babylonians tried to stamp them out. The Romans took them as their province of Judea and held on for 600 years or so, first under traditional Roman religion and later under Christianity. At around the 600-year mark, the lands to the east of the Roman Empire were beginning to adopt Islam, another Abrahamic religion that splits off from Jewish tradition at Abraham's sons, following his elder son Ishmael rather than his younger son Isaac. They took the Levant and looked towards many of the same holy sites that Jews and Christians had shared. They ruled that land for about 400 years, and then the Crusades began in 1066 CE. The European Christians riled themselves up to go retake the Holy Land from the heathens, and that went as well as it ever does. For 2 centuries, there were waves of warfare, devastating, well, honestly, mostly Christian territories. But there was fighting among Christians and Muslims, Mongols invaded from the east, and finally a wave of Islamic Mamluks from Egypt rose up from the south and imposed their own reign. The Mamluks had no interest in letting any Christians or Jews persist in their nonsense, and largely persecuted the Jews within the state and expelled the Christians. The Christians, having to turn their united furor on something, and having been denied the Holy Land, turned it on the local Jewish population, and thus began the swath of suspicion and expulsion and inquisition. The Ottoman Turks conquered the Levant in 1516 CE. Having less prejudice against Jews than either the European Christians or the Egyptian Mamluks, they welcomed Jewish refugees from any part of the world. Not everyone in the area was quite so welcoming, though. Infighting among the various Abrahamic factions in the area led to the destruction of several of the remaining Jewish safe havens. In the end, the Ottoman government had to declare its intent to make formal harbors for Jewish safe havens, and bargain with its internal factions to make peace. By this point, it had been nearly 3 millennia since the founding of the Jewish Kingdom of Israel, and since its conquest, the Jewish people had found no reliable safe harbor to call home. The Ottomans offered the Jewish people a hope, and among those who wished to rule the Levant, it became a popular notion. Even Napoleon had a plan to send his Jews home to Israel. Do you see how, under these circumstances, this part of the Levant became more than just a historical homeland, but a symbol of hope, of freedom from persecution? This is how Zionism came to be. The relatively accepting rule of the Ottomans lasted close to 400 years, and over that time, places in Europe, in the West especially, tended to improve their relationships with their local Jewish populations. Many Jews were offered full citizenship and reasonable amount of integration. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe and in Russia, things were not any better, and Jews were often persecuted harshly with regular pogroms and expulsions. To be honest, things weren't really that much better in Western Europe either. There were still a lot of fears about Jews, and sometimes that would break out into violence. In 1896, an Austro-Hungarian Jew by the name of Theodor Herzl wrote a book called Der Judenstaat. He theorized in it that the best way to solve the problem of anti-Semitism was to create a new Jewish state, some place where Jews could go and be free from persecution, have a safe homeland for anyone. And what better place to put it than that slice of Levant where Jews were welcome now? That symbol of hope, the site of ancient Israel, the territory now known as Palestine, ruled by the Ottoman Turks. He even suggested that they resurrect the dead language of Hebrew, since Jews would be coming from all over the world. Movement towards this began in earnest in 1909, when the first kibbutz, or Jewish Socialist Commune, was founded. Simultaneously, the first Hebrew-speaking town formed in what would later become Tel Aviv. World War I broke out a mere 5 years later. The Turks, increasingly concerned about the Zionists, who seemed like they might want to steal the area of Palestine away from them, started expelling Jews, and the British saw a weakness. Their foreign minister, Arthur Balfour, drafted a proposal to the Jewish community, both the actual Zionists and the imagined cabal of international Jewry. In it, he proposed that once the British had reclaimed the area from the Turks, Palestine would be remanded to the Jewish people. But the promises that Britain made of independence and sovereignty weren't just reserved for the Jews. They were also in contact with several Arabic ethnicities and groups around the region, offering sovereignty or partial sovereignty once the Turks fell, in exchange for help during the war. You've heard of T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia? Well, he was a real person, and he lived among the Arab peoples of that area for many years. In fact, he was rather assimilated, and unlike what you'd expect from such a colonial British atmosphere. He came to the British and proposed a map of countries to be divided up along ethnic and national lines. One state for the Jews and another for the Kurds, several different Arabic nations, all with the aim of peace, which was, of course, summarily ignored. The British and French had no interest in keeping the peace in the Middle East. They wanted to dump all of those satanic Jews into that one little sliver of coast and push the Arabs into that unusable swath of desert and keep all the best land for themselves. They literally drew the borders with a ruler to keep them tidy. Humans are so messy. Meanwhile, Jews desperate to find a safe home joined the British Army, and others in the Levant, both Jewish and Arabic, spied on their Ottoman overlords. Combined with a huge Arab revolt, the Ottomans were so off balance that the British and French were able to overpower them and take the region. It cost them very little to offer up this sliver of land to dump their Jews in, under careful supervision, of course. The Balfour Declaration was ratified by the League of Nations, and Israel was reborn. Just one problem, though. There were still rather a lot of people living in the area who weren't Jews. At very nearly the same time as the Balfour Declaration was ratified, the Tsarists in Russia were cooking up the Protocols propaganda. When the Russian Revolution came, both sides heavily attacked the Jewish population. And suddenly, there was this huge influx of Russian Jews into the newly declared borders of Palestine before the Balfour Declaration's ink was even dry. Things got even more crowded as anti-Semitism rose following the translation of the protocols into European languages. Between World Wars I and II, many European nations started genteelly exporting their Jews to the newly formed Palestine, without their goods and money, of course. This pushed hundreds of thousands of Jews into this small Levantine coast over the course of just a few short years. The local Arab population had been displaced and subjugated by the British invasion. Rather than getting a nation of their own, they had become disregarded, second-class citizens, and a new form of invader in the face of these largely well-educated and professional European Jews had claimed first place in the world's sight. Of course they revolted. Who could blame them? The Jews proposed a two-state solution, which was likely unfair. The Arabs rejected it. The Nazis proposed moving the Jews to Madagascar, which, aside from being logistically difficult, there were already people living there too. The British proposed abandoning the area and letting the Jews and Arabs rule themselves together. Both sides hated that plan too. The bad blood was already sown. And then the Holocaust took off in earnest. Suddenly Jews were absolutely pouring into Palestine, largely illegally. Europe was killing them in droves, and places like the US were turning them back at the border. The budding Jewish state, rough as it was, seemed like the only option. By the end of World War II, the Palestinian Arabs were frankly squashed between the Jewish settlers and the British colonizers. Jews already made up 33% of the population in the Palestinian land, and more refugees were pouring in every day from Europe, from Russia, and from the surrounding Arabic countries, where the locals were starting to eye them with suspicion. The United Nations finally declared that there would be a two-state solution, splitting Arabic Palestine from Jewish Palestine and having a joint rule in Jerusalem in deference to its holiness. That didn't actually work. The British tried to hold back the tide of Jewish refugees pouring into the area, but provided no other safe destination for these angry, tired, and desperate people to go. In increasing alarm, the Arab League, consisting of Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, increasingly openly showed their support for the Palestinian Arabs, Lebanon going so far as to annex the proposed Arabic territory across the Jordan in order to keep it safe. The turning point was the support of the American and Russian governments for the Jewish fighters. With foreign-provided arms and logistical support, the Jews were able to rise up, claiming Israel for themselves. They expelled both the British and the Arab League, and in 1948, Israel as we know it was founded, a land taken and retaken, stolen and restolen. A true Jewish state for the first time in millennia. Over time, armistices were made with the various members of the Arab League, and eventually Israel was recognized by the United Nations. I am in both deep sympathy for the Israelis and deep horror for the Palestinian Arabs. On the Israeli side, it seems very clear that there needed to be some end to the waves of genocidal hostility against Jews in the diaspora. And I have yet to hear anybody propose a solution more practical than Herzl's Jewish state. I mean, I personally think that it would all be solved if people just stopped treating Jews as if they were different from any other grouping of people and, tried not killing them for a while, but for some reason that just doesn't seem to happen. Now that a Jewish state does exist, it's a refuge, a safeguard against exactly that sort of violence. And though I obviously hope it never comes to this, I do take some comfort in knowing that should my country ever turn on me, there will be some place safe for children and non-combatants to go. But the Arabs living in the Levant are and always were just as human as everybody else. They've had their land stripped away, had colonizers come in and then dump their own undesirables on top of them. And then the colonizers treat those undesirables as more deserving than the local Arabs. It's unconscionable. I've said it before, and I'm sure I'll say it again, but if there is anywhere in this world worth living, there are already people living there, and to evict them is to become the oppressor. It is no surprise, at least to me, that the Arabic world has come to resent Israel. Their land was stripped from them and then given to somebody else, and the people who did the stripping declared this to be right and just, without any regard for the people who were already there. And then the way things are now, Arab Israelis are treated as second-class citizens, and non-citizens, the Palestinian population, are herded into ghettos and then subsequently subjected to genocidal violence. Anyone not primed with the Islamophobic viewpoint has to admit that this is in grave violation of human rights. The settlements and the treatment of Palestinians within the borders, it's inhumane and frankly nauseating. Yet, all attempts at diplomatic ends come to naught. The oppressed Palestinians have to scrape the bottom of the barrel to fight back against their oppressors, coming up with terrorist groups like Hamas and little else. Meanwhile, the current Israeli regime has fascistic tendencies that lead to this self-righteous, jingoistic continuation of the violence without any intent to pull it back. I've been to Israel once, and frankly, I found it disturbing. I know deep in my bones that this is the best solution anybody's come up with to prevent my people, my ancestors, my relatives, me, from being killed by senseless hatred and violence. And yet, what I saw there has me frankly distraught. But even this is unfair. My perspective is still an outsider perspective. Israel is an established country now. Children, generations, have grown up within its borders, speaking Hebrew as their first language. They're a people, not a monolith. And what Israel is now is not something that can be addressed solely through its past. We also have to talk about the present. So that's what we'll talk about next time.